Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of the listeners of the Daily Friends Show, and welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Gabriel Crouse. Gabriel, how are you today?
Very well, Nick. Nice to see you 2 days in a row on the Daily Friends Show.
Good to have you on 2 days in a row to give us your beardly wisdom. And Miss Sara gone. Sara, how are you?
Hopefully I haven't got beardly wisdom to offer.
Something much better.
Yes, yes, your version.
I'm leaving right now. I'm going to cry.
So I do apologize to our listeners if they do hear a bit of a whirring in the background. I am currently running on a generator because City Power decided that our distributor wasn't going to function this morning. So I've been without power for a while, but we continue on. That is the South African way. And let us first discuss an important issue which has been ongoing. We mentioned, I think, very briefly on the show yesterday, and that is a land invasion in Rabie Ridge in the north of Johannesburg. There is a piece of land that is owned by, Gabriel will talk about the owner briefly, but it's owned by a private individual, and some community members have invaded the land, claiming that it is government land and therefore they can erect their shacks there. And over the last 2 days, there have been running battles between the police, private security, and the land invaders who are setting up on the land there. They've erected a lot of shacks and stuff. There's quite a lot of footage of it. You could go look on YouTube. You'll be able to see an ENCA report where the police are fighting with them. So the government has insisted that this is definitely not their land, that it belongs to the private individual, and that's why they're enforcing the property rights here. Gabriel, you think this case is important for the wider conversation around property rights in South Africa. Tell us what your thoughts are about this case specifically and what it says about the larger issue.
Yeah, so I think one interesting feature here is that the land is owned by a company which acquired it fairly recently. That company is called something like the South African Housing and Infrastructure Fund, SAHIR. And that company was founded and is led by Rali Mampeule, who, as a sort of connoisseur of the land debate over many years, I have come across many times. Because he says all the right things. He's a rags to riches guy who started out as a street hawker and then got a low-level job and then climbed his way up the ladder in real estate development. He is billed as a billionaire, as having become a South African Rand billionaire before turning 40 years old through real estate development. He argues politically very strongly for spreading title deeds, for title deeds being granted at a much faster pace for RDP homes built by the government so that people are incentivized to maintain their homes, so that people can sell their homes and so that people can leverage their homes to start their own businesses. He's big into that because it's, I suppose he's eaten the fruits of the free market tree, and he wants to spread that opportunity to others. He's also very keen on spreading title deeds in the former Bantustans or homelands, where the apartheid system systematically denied Black people the right to enter the banking universe or to buy on loan or leverage the assets that they have, or pass really their assets on to their children in a safe and secure way. Being very vocally opposed to the maintenance of that system by the ANC government. Although being a corporate guy, he doesn't like to sort of call out parties by name so much, but he does call out policy by name. And I think that's extremely important and admirable. And here you see why it matters. You've got your title deed and you've got the cameras rolling. You stand a chance of getting the police. Doesn't always work, but you stand a chance of getting the police to help you defend your stuff. So part of the reason this is important is because it's sort of a case of things working, you might say, as they ought. And Sahira's project there is to lay out the necessary infrastructure to begin development so that this land can turn into real estate that has a real value add proposition there. Here's here's another part of the reason that the story is important. So in other words, the bigger boo is when you look behind the door number one to who owns this, you don't find white monopoly capital. A very important aspect of this case, however, is that I see in this a move from service delivery protests, which have been the sort of generic catch-all term for violent protests, which we see at a rate of 10 a day pre-COVID, turn into something new. I think land invasion protests, there seems to be a sort of watermark land invasion protest. That's not to say it's the first. It is to say that it's the first to gather as much media attention as it has. All of the 24/7 news channels have just been broadcasting live stream footage of the police Inyalas running one way and the crowds running the other way, and then the crowds running back and the Inyalas going back and the canisters going back and forth, and the 3-day sort of tussle of hard force to try and gain control of the land, which has now been had, and fences are being put up around it pursuant to the infrastructure layout. But I think that this kind of invasion is something that you should expect. And the reason is simple. The expropriation bill says that the kind of scenario that it has front of mind for expropriation without compensation is where land has been abandoned, where the owner has lost control of it. If Rally Mampuebule had not managed to secure control of this land, he should be expropriated without compensation under the bill. And invaders know that. Agents provocateur in political parties and their sort of henchmen and goons on the ground know that. And I know from people on the ground I've been speaking to in rural and township South Africa, there are encouragements being made, and this has been the case for years, but this is really ramping up now because the bill is turning into a law. If you can get in and invade a piece of land now, you can get the whole property legally. The government will expropriate it, and then you'll either get to stay there, or maybe one day, if they even get around to this title deed thing, they'll go ahead and do that. And this is not just, there's the sweet little sideline story of Dunkeld West, a fairly upmarket part of the world where nice empty stand was invaded, and court order has said you can't evict the occupants because COVID and so on. But this has been spreading through all the major city centers and peri-urban centers around small town South Africa for years. I just think it's gaining momentum now because it's getting that media traction, and that's driven by a policy shift on the horizon.
Right. No, I think those are very good points. I will say, I think you're very correct to say this is definitely not the first. Land invasions have been a steadily growing problem, sort of creeping in many parts of South Africa. But usually they're just not covered really at all. It's mentioned sort of at the end of a news bulletin, if it's even mentioned. And yet they are ongoing sources of tension, violence, conflict, that kind of thing. And it's not just for political reasons that people do this. Sometimes there's a financial reason. Someone will say to this group of people, if we invade this land and I'll take over the management of it, and then I'll charge you all rent. But if you help me to invade it, then I'll give you a good price, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on. But one of the things that perhaps I'm just looking for another silver lining here, in this story, is that the community they claimed incorrectly that the property belonged to government, and so in other words, at least rhetorically, they were not willing to engage in a fight to invade private land, which to me seems like a little bit of a victory in the battle of ideas, or a sign that things are going right. Am I being too optimistic, Sara, or what's your take?
Well, I think it's fairly unusual. I think I can understand the misunderstanding because it belonged to one level of the state until fairly recently. So the fact that it is legally in the hands of a private holder, the mistake would be understandable. I think the problem is, however, that most land invasions, or not most land invasions, but very many are on private property. But what I think this does highlight is it's two things. One is the problem for anyone who owns land that is invaded is that it is so difficult to get people off that land, whether you want to do something else with that land or whether you actually want to use that land to develop housing, it's extremely difficult to get people evicted from that land. And it's made more difficult by the fact that the government has said, in terms of the disaster management scenario, that all that sort of thing must be held in abeyance pending the end of the state of disaster, which has its own consequences. And the problem, of course, is that people invade land. It's difficult to get them off. And as I know they have been having experience in the Cape, is land that's been identified and is intended to be built upon for people who've sought that land many years ago, is now in the hands of people that are very difficult to remove, because one of the things that a municipality has to do is find alternative accommodation. Now, half of the problem is that if they had alternative accommodation, we'd probably be in less of a problem. It also, what it does is it highlights the fact that what people want is land near urban centres. It's not about every aspirant black landowner wanting a piece of land from which to grow crops. People want to, South Africa's urbanising, and people want to be near the urban centres, and I think the ANC has missed a beat on that one.
No, exactly. That's a very good point. Almost all these land invasions, it's always in a city, and it's, people usually coming from either the shack settlement where there wasn't room or the rent was too high or something, or from a rural area coming to find a place for them to live so that it can be close to the city, so they can be close to economic opportunities and to other people. Because in South Africa, basically everything is better around the cities than in the rural areas, from law and order to services.
If I can just jump in, but you guys are missing out on what the mayor had to say about this. The Johannesburg mayor explained this. How could you miss this? The problem is not rural South Africans coming to look for places to stay in Johannesburg so that they could find jobs. If that were the case, how could you possibly explain the police in Nyalas chasing them away? That would be terrible. The problem is foreigners, he said. People from Lesotho. People from Mozambique, he said. So this is the problem. This is why you must chase them away with the police vans.
So the problem is, as long as the mayors and foreigners are a toxic mix, and if you hold that position of Joburg mayor, a toxic mix, you're right. Yeah.
I didn't see that, but thank you for bringing that to our attention, Gabriel, because it seems that the ANC can only be bothered to defend property rights when they can cast the property invaders as foreigners, and so mix in a dash of xenophobia there.
And I must say, I saw the radio teams on site speak to quite a lot of the aspirant land invaders in languages not Sotho or Mozambique. So I don't know where our dear mayor is getting his facts from, but I think I understand quite clearly where he gets his politics from.
Indeed. Anyway, we are going to move on now to the next story. So on Thursday, we covered the comments that were reported in the media by a UCT lecturer. I don't have his name written down here, but I'm sure Gabriel will remind us. Who there was a 50. Right, that's the one. There was a 15-second clip released of one of his lectures where he said that basically Hitler had committed no crime because this is what white people had been doing to black people for ages. Now, since then, he's gone on to do interviews with SAFM, and he's also gone on to release to the media the entire lecture that he gave to provide context. Gabriel, you've been looking into this. What is your takeaway from this event? Is there anything to clarify his comments in the greater context? Because I think we should always be wary, and this was a failing on my part. I didn't realize that it had only been a 15-second clip that had been released to the media. So should we have waited to hold our criticism, or was it justified?
Yeah, no, I think the thrust of it still holds up. So the professor's argument is that he starts out by saying on SAFM that white people are just terrible because they only have ethics when it applies to black people. So this is the nature of this is the launching point of his defense, is more racism. I think one thing that's been lost in the coverage of this is the fact that it's not really up to Jews to condemn racism or the Holocaust or Nazism. It's up to all of us. Nor were only Jews victims of the Nazis' extermination program or war. And this is important because I think South Africans sometimes feel uncomfortable. I think the world often feels more comfortable condemning anti-Semitism than condemning racism straightforwardly. And all forms of racism are important to condemn. And when you defend your racist claim by saying, well, no, look, the problem is white people are not good because they can't apply standards of ethics to themselves, then you're just reinforcing the real underlying issue at hand, which is that a UCT professor is an overt racist. He then goes on to say that his statement's been taken out of context, that if you study linguistics properly, you'll find that any statement negates itself and only gains a positive meaning if you look at its externalities and its context, which is, he says categorically, I actually made no statement that Hitler committed no crime, because that sentence itself is empty, which is a fancy way of over-exaggerating a simple point, which I do have sympathy, which is that context matters. Now, perusing, albeit hastily, through the fuller lecture, he does not argue the legal point. He doesn't argue the point that what Hitler did was morally wrong, but legally permissible, because it had already been done to black people. Because you couldn't hang such a legal argument on the facts. The facts of the day were that Hitler broke the law. He broke German law. Amongst other things, he went to jail for breaking German law after the beer hall putsch. He then almost certainly was involved with burning the Reichstag, the parliament, in order to trigger an illegal state of emergency.
Right. And I
these
think
are very...
the Weimar Constitution as well. So he was acting in a state of emergency kind of situation as well.
His brown shirts and his black shirts committed street level violence on an open and ongoing basis for many years. Kristallnacht was illegal by German law. The assassination of some of his brown shirts at his own ordering in order to get rid of the embarrassing homosexuals and such like on that front and replace them with the black shirts and get the Gestapo really going. The power plays from 1921 through 1933 through 1939 were illegal. The annexation of Czechoslovakia, the Anschluss, the votes in the Anschluss, illegal. Hitler broke international law the way I eat breakfast on a daily basis, eagerly, I suppose. And this is all before the Holocaust, which you might say wasn't exactly illegal. There wasn't an accepted standard of international law at the time, but it certainly was against the nominal laws of both Germany and Poland, such as they stood. So, I mean, there was no statute which said, look, as long as you only kill black people, it's fine. In the professor's argument, he also says, look at the Congo, 10 million people were killed in the Congo by the Belgians. That's a number which, I've made a bit of a study of this, that no evidence supports. But at the same time, he says, and this was just totally accepted. The only time people started thinking it was bad to kill lots of people, that massacring was bad, was when white people were subjected to it. That's the argument that he tries to rephrase his statement as meaning. That this kind of thing was just accepted everywhere until white people suffered, and that triggered a moral change. Now, that's not true. If you make any kind of study of European politics before World War I, you find the massive shift of King Leopold II going from being everyone's favorite white burden supremacist, sort of, well, trust me to take care of the poor black people because they can't do it themselves, but I'm very nice and I'm spreading peace and civilization and it's wonderful. And everyone said, well, you're wonderful. Thank you so much for doing that. And then people like Joseph Conrad became world stars for exposing the hand-chopping, brutal, racist atrocities going on in the Congo. And this changed the prestige both of King Leopold II and of Belgium. It resulted in the decolonization, in the first steps of decolonization there. It resulted in pro-independence movements starting up around the world, including in South Africa. The African National Congress, or what we now call the ANC, was, started out, amongst other things, by reference to colonial atrocities in Namibia, what we now call Namibia. And their first contributions to the UN were to say, look, you can't do this kind of thing. This is terrible. It's just like the concentration camps that the Afrikaners suffered. Afrikaans people put into concentration camps by the English was also condemned internationally. His facts are completely off the range. And if you look at his original speech, they don't fit what he's now trying to say. What he said in his original speech was that there are two senses of morality, and there's one which is white. And according to that sense of morality, Hitler did nothing wrong, really. And that's the same racist sort of background idea that he starts off with in his defense, saying, look, I'm not even too bothered by this because white people have their own set of ethics and they don't apply to themselves. They only apply to black people. So I can't take them too seriously.
Right. So there's a lot to respond to there, Sara, I think. But just to add to your point there, Gabriel, about the historical inaccuracy of what he's claiming, there are papal orders from the 1500s ordering the Spanish crown to treat the natives of Central America more justly because they were being abused by the conquistadors. So, it's not like human rights suddenly were invented in 1945. They have a much longer and more developed history there. And you'd think that a professor of political history would know that. But anyway, Sara, your thoughts on this whole mess?
Well, you see, Sharp is well known as an anti-white racist. He has a very scaly reputation. He's done a number of things that have brought him into disrepute. It doesn't affect him terribly much because he's got his supporters, and being anti-white is, par for the course these days. I think the problem with this one is that it's not a statement made, as he often has made in the past, at a meeting gathering outside the Great Hall or Jamison Hall or whatever it's now called. It's a lecture drafted, written, set down. In other words, it was planned and it was processed. So what he's doing is communicating a whole set of false ideas to first-year students, most of whom will know nothing about the Holocaust and nothing about Hitler. So this is what, if you send your child to the University of Cape Town and goes to the first year of politics, this is what they're going to be exposed to. So it's both the factual inaccuracy and the complete obsession with a very limited breadth of history. And to extrapolate as much as he does from chosen bits and pieces of history that suit his sort of pro-African narrative, I think the biggest problem is less the actual comment than, if I were UCT, I'm not sure I'd be wanting to have my reputation as Africa's top university sullied by this sort of comment.
Right. I think there's some argument to say that by several metrics, not just the metrics that we would use, Wits possibly overtook that from UCT in recent years, but UCT is still solid. Gabriel, any final thoughts on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Sara had to say. I think our criticism of the statement initially is, I think it stands. The danger here is not so much that a brown shirt movement is going to be started in this academic classroom. It's rather the broader issue of peddling misinformation to students, indoctrinating them in a deeper way of thinking. That certainly doesn't go far enough to universally condemning anti-Semitism, but definitely also doesn't go far enough to condemning racism to court, and instead kind of reinforces the wrong kind of ideas. And it's a shame.
Definitely. And as I said then, I doubt the university would accept such incredibly racist ways of examining the world from a white professor, unless, of course, it was a pale, at least some sort of imitation of these sentiments. So, they should probably have a single standard, people of all races. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's what he wants, right? He wants a single standard.
Right.
Let's give it a go.
Yeah. Okay, for our final story, very briefly, the Constitutional Court is looking at new justices, I believe. And Sara, the boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions movement, which is against Israel and calls for those three things against the state of Israel, is trying to block a particular person who's being considered for the Constitutional Court. On what grounds, Sara? Please tell us a little bit about it very briefly.
Basically, what they've done is they've put in a representation to the Judicial Services Commission, which considers appointments to all the levels of court, requesting that Judge David Unterhalter not be considered for appointment to the court because he sits on the executive committee of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, and since the South African government's position on that conflict is that Israel is a cruel occupier, essentially, and the Palestinians are under a cruel occupation, and it basically supports the Palestinians considerably, that the ethos that he may have imbued by virtue of his position and less by virtue of his probably being Jewish and not so much his position, I'm not sure, you can decide on that, he isn't a fit and proper person to sit on the court, and that a nominee's view of culture, history, etc., are important when being taken into account, etc., etc. Basically, they accuse the South African Jewish Board of Deputies as being the equivalent of the Broederbond, and it's to promote, and one of the things it does wrong is it accuses pro-Palestinian organizers and organizations of anti-Semitism, and it goes along these lines, and essentially that Palestinian rights would not be, he wouldn't consider them favorably by virtue of all these things, and therefore he's not appropriate for the Constitutional Court. I don't think one way or the other this would have any bearing, but with BDS, let's be frank. I mean, BDS is an organization that doesn't itself promote violence to achieve the destruction of Israel, but BDS's very goals are to achieve the destruction of Israel through boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions. So it's not an issue of nuance, and in a situation that has both for and against both peoples and the way the area is governed. So let me put it this way: I think if the shoe were on the other foot and someone tried to block the appointment of a Muslim judge, and we have a fair number of them, for the same but opposite reason, if I can put it that way, there would be outrage. And I mean, David Unterhalter is no slouch as a legal persona. So whether this is going to have any impact on them, on the Services Commission, I do not know. But let's put it this way: if he were not to go by virtue of the smear of being Jewish and being on the Board of Deputies, the Judicial Services Commission would be setting an incredibly bad precedent for the future. I suspect if they don't want him to be on, they'll just sort of say, well, we need more blacks on the bench, not more whites, and they wouldn't have to deal with it anyway.
So, Gabriel, I haven't left you with much time to comment here, but in a sort of 30-second spiel, what's your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Sara says, I think if you connect this back to Chief Justice Mogoeng, who was, strongly criticized for praying that Israel would maintain its sovereignty and that its people would find peace, you do get a sense of what position is fashionable and what position is not. And I think that it doesn't speak well to the credibility of the Judicial Services Commission if it keeps kind of picking political lines like this as a basis to put glass ceilings above people's heads or usher them out the door.
Can I just add that what they haven't done is come forward with any examples of judgments made or actions done by him, which shows explicit bias.
Right. That's a very important point. Okay, well, we're going to close it there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed the show. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And see you tomorrow for the next episode of The Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.